Okay, so as you guys will recall, last week in last week's lecture, we went over some of the history of the economic policy in the United States before 1920, and then we went into the 20s, the Great Depression, and the New Deal, and then I ended with discussing, or briefly touching on, rather, some things about the legacy of the New Deal, and that's what I want to go into in more depth today. So this is going to be a shorter lecture. I actually unintentionally went into this week's material on last week's lecture. So a lot of this stuff you didn't read, so you can just consider it a little bit of extra. But again, this will help you take notes for week three if you prefer to do so with a lecture rather than just reading in a book. So anyway, um, going to go through a few things of how the New Deal impacted both immediately and in the future during its time. So first of all, starting with the New Deal, the government's role in in the economy uh, began to greatly expand. Now, FDR during this time he went against previous policy and he utilized what's called deficit spending in order to fund the New Deal programs. Now, deficit spending just refers to the government spending money on something that, while they hope it'll uh, result in that it'll have positive results later, they don't currently actually have that money, and so they're putting themselves into debt. A lot like if you take out loans for a car or a house, you have that product, but you're basically spending money that's not your own, and so you owe money back, and so you're in debt or you have a deficit on your hands, which is why it's called deficit spending. And so that's what's happening with the government when they do this in order to fund programs like under the New Deal. So, um, in addition to the deficit, you also have social programs under the New Deal being shut down during the 1930s by the Supreme Court, mostly because they saw them as being indicative of the president starting to gain too much legislative power to the point where it was unconstitutional. But even keeping those things in mind, you did have these programs accomplish a lot of big degree of help for people. For instance, farmers didn't receive a lot of help before the New Deal, and also millions of jobs being created as a result of the public works projects that were put on during the New Deal. So, with that in mind, you also have what's called a welfare state, and the New Deal was thought to have set the stage for the creation of a welfare state. A welfare state basically just means that the government in that country directly contributes to the well-being of the citizens there. You do hear this term thrown around a lot today, and people who don't agree with social programs to one degree or another will often use it as an insult for social programs. They'll talk negatively about the welfare state, but whether you love social programs or hate them, or you're somewhere in between, all a welfare state means is that the government directly helps the citizens that it looks over. So finally, you do have foreshadowing or even outright inspiration for future economic policies. Now, on the right there is Lyndon B. Johnson, one of our presidents during the 60s, and he came up with the idea of what was called the Great Society. So he started much with the same types of ideas that the New Deal started with, but he also put more focus on helping the poor. Remember, the New Deal was criticized as not having done a good enough job to help the poorest of the poor. So he decides to start funding education in lower income areas and overall trying to contribute to um, more economic equality across the board. And then, of course, coming up to the present, you've got ideas like the Green New Deal, which I'll get into more later. But so, yeah, even in some cases, you have people naming things after the New Deal, looking to it for inspiration because it did have that kind of an impact. So, anyway, that's a bit about how the government's role expanded after the New Deal or as a result of the New Deal. And now we're going to go into some of the responses or reception of the New Deal, past and present. So, um, not everybody liked the New Deal. Not everybody likes it in the present, and uh, during the New Deal, you actually had criticism. Most of it came from conservatives, meaning Republicans, as well as Democrats, who also leaned more towards the conservative side in terms of their party. And you had a couple of different groups here. First, the American Liberty League, which was formed in 1934. It died out within about 6 years, but during its time, it began to accuse the New Deal of granting too much power to the president and thus being unconstitutional. Now, if that sounds familiar, it very much should, because remember, I already once during this lecture, and at least once last week, mentioned that the Supreme Court had found some of these organizations to be unconstitutional in how much power it gave to the president. Now, if the ultimate interpreter of the Constitution, the Supreme Court, finds something unconstitutional, that definitely lends credence to at least some of the conclusions of organizations like the American Liberty League. And on top of this, you had another group called the Conservative Coalition, which in the late 30s wrote and distributed 100,000 copies of what they called the Conservative Manifesto. You've heard of the Communist Manifesto, and now you've got the Conservative Manifesto being distributed, again, over 100,000 times. And this group, in true conservative fashion, wanted to lower taxes and government spending and ultimately balance the budget. So that was their vision for this. Now, conservatives, before I get to criticisms from the left, conservatives on the whole were concerned about the effect that the New Deal programs and legislation would have on free enterprise. Free enterprise being where just the function of the market with as little government intrusion as possible. So how does the market function based mostly on just supply and demand and success without the government coming in to help counteract any issues that might come up. So anyway, on the left, you also had some criticism like what I mentioned before. The New Deal didn't do enough to help the poor. The New Deal didn't do enough to address social injustice or racial inequality. And it even goes to those people who didn't think that the New Deal was, I'm going to use the word extreme enough. In other words, those people wanted not a program like the New Deal that they saw as just helping to prop up capitalism, but something that would actually take the government and the economy more leftwards. Now, probably one of the chief criticisms leveled against the New Deal, which it is actually grounded in truth, is that the New Deal didn't end the Depression. So the New Deal began to wind down in the early 1940s, and it wasn't until during or after World War II that the economy recovered. So put those ideas together, that if the Great Depression had ended during or before the end of the life of the New Deal, we could give the New Deal a lot more credit for ending the Depression than the way things worked out in real life, where the Depression persisted after the New Deal ended. Not that things weren't helped by it, but the Depression as a whole did not go away just because of the New Deal. In spite of this, though, it did help in certain areas, and one in particular I want to touch on before we go to the next slide is that it helped preserve democracy in the United States. Now, in other places in the world during this time, you had people in Europe, for instance, in desperate situations, turning to various leaders who promised to get them out of their troubles. And of course, this would result in the installation of dictators such as Benito Mussolini in Italy, and these were not good people. So even when people don't look fondly on FDR, he was nowhere close to being cut from the same cloth as the dictators in Europe. And so by the New Deal going on and people not trying to push for, well, most people at least not trying to push for something more extreme, we allowed for some government involvement but still preserved democracy in this country, which is obviously very important. Now, anyway, those were some of how the New Deal was responded to, past and present, and people still do debate over how effective it was to this day, and whether or not any more New Deals should come out in the future. And I'll say more about that at the final slide. So, third thing I want to go over here is some lasting effects of the New Deal programs and the legislation under the New Deal. So, you have certain programs that are still in place today, with probably the most mentioned one, easiest one to recall, especially, is Social Security, where you have supplementary income given to certain people who either they're retired or they can't work due to a recent layoff or an injury that disabled them from working. Now, again, it's supplementary income. It doesn't, you can't really live that well off it, if at all, on its own, but it does give you a little bit of help. And so, and it still continues to be popular across the board with most people on both sides of the political spectrum to a degree. Now, a couple of other organizations I wanted to go over that I think are interesting are the FDIC and the SEC. The FDIC is the Federal Deposits Insurance Commission, and or commission. Let me check. Corporation. Sorry. Um, and what this does is it helps prevent people from losing their savings and bank deposits, that kind of stuff. You'll remember in the Great Depression, a lot of banks failed, and as a result of that, people completely lost their savings. So this program helps to ensure, pardon the pun, that that won't happen. And what happens is they oversee thousands of banks, not all of them in the U.S., but thousands of them, and people can get funds insured up to $250,000. In some cases, more than that, like 500,000 if you have a joint account, like if a couple has one of those. And so, if something happens to the bank, if those funds are insured, you can get them back. Just like if you have car insurance and you get in a crash, or your car gets stolen. That happened to me once. You can either get repairs done to the vehicle once it's recovered, or if you can't get the car back or it's totaled in an accident, the insurance company will get you a new car. So anyway, that's just some programs that are still in place today. Now, some legislation that we take for granted these days, like minimum wage, the 40-hour work week with overtime and getting paid time and a half if you go over that, um, and even child labor laws. A lot of that stuff traces its history back to the New Deal. Even though we take it for granted, we have the New Deal to thank for those regulations. And then last on this slide, there are a lot of organizations that either they died out because they fell into disuse, they weren't needed anymore, or because uh, in other cases they were declared unconstitutional for the reasons I went over earlier. Now, even though some of these organizations may not be here in and of themselves, the effects, or the I guess you could say, the lasting impressions of those organizations are still here. So a lot of the roads and airports and other transportation infrastructure that was built during the New Deal under these no longer existing programs, we still have we still have that infrastructure today. And for one instance, you've got on the picture on the right there, you've got uh, an observation tower in what is it? Mount Diablo State Park, and that's here in California, and that was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps during the New Deal, or while that program was in effect. Now, on top of this, you also one other example I have is the putting in place of electricity in rural areas. That was started during the New Deal, and by the 50s, rural areas that where most of them didn't have any electricity before, most of them had it, and that electricity is still in place in those areas, and it continues to be improved as technology progresses forward. So those are some of the lasting effects, and yeah, a lot of national parks as well. If you go see those, have the New Deal to thank for their creation or improvement. Now, last slide, as I said, this is I don't remember if I said it or not, but this is a much shorter lecture. I accidentally went over into this week's material on last week's lecture, so I'm giving you guys a little bit of extra here, and it'll help you take notes and give you some extra information about economic policy. Now, just a few other changes that took place in American life. Nowadays, it's becoming more and more common for people to look to the government as a to help solve a crisis. I mean, look what's going on now. Uh, the government's very much in direction of what's going on, and in an indirect way, it's having a big effect on the economy. But anyway, these days it's not for a lot of people. It's not the question isn't should the government intervene, but how should the government intervene in this particular problem. So that's one thing. Political life changed. So you did have changes to the Democratic Party, such as African Americans who previously, due to Lincoln and his association with emancipation being features of the Republican Party, African Americans were previously inclined to line up with or to be a part of the Republican Party. But due to some degree of help, a lot would say not enough, but to some degree of help being done to that group as a part of the New Deal, uh, it became more and more common, for African Americans to uh, join sides with the Democratic Party. So our economy today is what's known as a fixed economy, or excuse me, fixed economy, mixed economy, and a mixed economy. What that is it just takes parts of what's called a centrally planned economy, like you had in the Soviet Union with communism, where the government has total centralized control over what goes on in the economy, and then on the other side you've got a free market with free enterprise, which I described earlier. And so what this does, it just takes a mix of those and it tries to bring out the best of both of them and try to minimize the worst that either of them would bring about on its own, like uh, the tendency for distribution of income to become one-sided in a free market, or um, all the corruption that occurs under a government with as much power as you had in like the Soviet Union, for example. But anyway, that's a mixed economy. Some don't like a mixed economy, some want one or the other, but it's how our economy and many other economies around the world work today. Last point is I hinted earlier that that other New Deals have been planned or suggested at least, and that debates continue over the effectiveness of the New Deal and whether or not those future New Deals should even come into play. Now, on the picture on the right, you'll see, among other people, Alexandria Ocasio Cortez. I have trouble pronouncing her name sometimes, but you see her delivering a speech on what's called the Green New Deal. Um, and so, what that is, it's just a plan of over the next few decades to slowly start transforming the infrastructure of America, both transportation and uh, in terms of buildings, to greener and greener technology and phasing out fossil fuels and lessening our dependence on those things and bringing in zero emissions technology. Now, this will involve a lot of overhaul and a lot of retrofitting on a lot of buildings. We have countless buildings that would need that in the United States, and so some are seeing this as, maybe it's not the most practical thing. Would it be worth it to likely go into a lot more deficit spending for the sake of bringing these things about? Well, whereas others think, it's even if it takes that, it's we see this as being better in the long run for the environment and by extension better for us because our environment's going to be cleaner because of the cleaner technology that's going to be put into place. But anyway, so that's a lot about the legacy. That's some rather about the legacy of the New Deal. Um, so again, feel free to ask any questions if you need any help. And so that is week 3, and I will see you guys for week 4.